Thank you very much, Susan. So we are actually very privileged because we have someone who's joining us all the way from the COP26 discussions in Glasgow. And he will be our moderator. So let me say a little something about him. He is the founder, co-founder, and currently executive director of the Association of Young Environmental Journalists. It's a nonprofit and environmental media hub working to engage and educate civil society on environmental sustainability through journalism and youth development, something that we definitely need so much of these days. The organization is now a member of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It's a winner, a national winner of the Philippines 10 Accomplished Youth Organizations and the Negros Young Heroes. And because of his work with IEDGE, he was chosen by the European Commission's International Cooperation and Development to be one of the 15 young leaders for development from all over the world to speak at the European Development Days 2019 in Brussels, Belgium, on climate change and inequalities. And he also recently became the first Filipino to receive the ASEAN Youth Eco Champion Award in the junior category by the ASEAN Environment Ministers. So to everybody guiding our discussion today and also guiding our distinguished panel of speakers, please help me welcome our moderator, Mr. Val Vestil. Val, the floor is
Thank
yours.
you. Thank you, Doc Jenny. Good morning. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Good morning, everybody. Yes, live here from Glasgow, Scotland for COP26. We're glad to be joined by over 150 participants here from across all member states of the ASEAN regional bloc. Your presence here is an opportune time, as had mentioned by my colleague, especially in the run up to COP26, where global leaders right now will be making important decisions about our planet and the people thriving in it. We're also live on our Facebook live streams on our official Facebook pages. So if you are watching from our live stream right now, please do feel free to share. Click the share button, and it will take you less than 5 seconds so that more people, more of your friends and your family from ASEAN will get to know more about the EU Research and Innovation Days. This morning, we are joined by esteemed speakers who will give us an overview and their deep and important insights on using science diplomacy to help support policy goals. This session will discuss the links between science, technology, and international affairs to address national and global challenges, especially as it relates to climate change and sustainability issues. So we're trying to answer the question, how can science and technology cooperation support policy to reach common goals? How can we facilitate scientific and research collaborations across countries to build a better world? It seems like it's a long list of things to try and understand and acknowledge and talk about, but we have invited speakers this morning who are experts in the field, who hopefully will try to make this conversation easier, especially for those who have yet to learn more about science diplomacy and its involvement in policy goals. We hope everybody will have an open mind and an open heart as we proceed to this these speeches and this panel discussion. Allow me to introduce our speakers for this morning. Our first speaker is the founder of SciDip Global, Dr. Marga Gual Soler. Allow me to introduce Dr. Marga. She's a champion of science diplomacy, recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. She's a high-level advisor in science diplomacy and science policy interfaces, specializing in building scientific bridges between nations facing diplomatic tensions. She's best known as a pioneer of science diplomacy education and for helping rebuild research ties between the United States and Cuba after the diplomatic normalization of 2015. Again, she's the founder of SciDip Global, an international strategy, advisory, research, and training consultancy, helping governments, scientists, NGOs, and multilateral organizations strengthen the links between science, technology, and international affairs to address common challenges and navigate global transformations. She helped design the science diplomacy strategies of many Latin American governments, Spain, and the EU, and in 2016 became the youngest member appointed to the Research, Innovation, and Science Experts, or RISE, advisory group, to former European Commissioner for Research and Innovation, Carlos Moedas. She currently advises the EU Horizon 2020 Science Diplomacy Cluster and the World Academy of Sciences, and is an associate researcher and professor at UNAM, Mexico. Marga is an associate editor of the AAAS Science and Diplomacy Journal and a high-profile speaker and media analyst on the science diplomacy dimensions of current affairs. She has received many honors and awards, including 100 Spanish Experts in Innovation, Huffington Post 40 Under 40 Latinos in Foreign Policy, Aspen Ideas Festival Scholar, Georgetown University Global Competitiveness Leadership Fellow, and WEF Young Global Leader. She is passionate about developing the next generation of science diplomats. Wow. And has developed innovative training methodologies, including improvisation and experiential learning. She co-founded the first Science Slam in Latin America in partnership with UNESCO. In 2019, she participated in the largest all-women expedition to Antarctica to promote women's leadership in science diplomacy and climate action. Ladies and gentlemen, we are really privileged to have with us Dr. Marga Gual Soler. Dr. Marga, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Val, for this very kind introduction. I just want to make sure you can hear me okay.
Perfectly fine, yes.
Great, thank you so much. Well, first of all, let me start thanking Euraxis ASEAN and Suzanne, Jenny, and Glenn, and of course, Ambassador Igor for this invitation. It is really impressive to see 180 people in this event. This really speaks to the interest that this topic has in the region and the will for strengthening ties, research ties between the EU and ASEAN. So thank you very much for having me in this very special time, right? This very special day. I think we are all looking frantically at the news and following what happens in Glasgow, because it is really a turning point in our ability to come together collectively to address our most pressing challenges, as Ambassador has very well put it. So I think what I will do today, since I'm the first speaker and we have a really long program, and actually congratulations, because you have an amazing lineup of speakers, you have workshops, you have a fantastic program over the next days. So I would just like to give you a very brief overview of this concept of science diplomacy in the EU, where it comes from, and a little bit of the history of why are we here today talking about science diplomacy. So this is a little bit of a setting the scene for us to situate ourselves in this journey that has been science diplomacy for the EU. I'm going to try to share my screen, and please let me know if you see my presentation.
Yes, it's visible.
Marga, yes.
Thank you very much. So the journey, and you have already mentioned this in my introduction, but I wanted to situate us back in 2014 in the previous commission. So we are in 2021, but this idea of science diplomacy really comes from way back, right? Sometimes when we hear about science diplomacy for the first time, we think it's something fairly new, and it is in terms of vocabulary, but it is not in terms of practice. If we think about how science and international affairs and geopolitics have intertwined for most of our history. However, until about 10 years ago, we didn't really have a vocabulary, a terminology, a label to put a tag on those activities and those processes and those policies that occur at the intersection of science and international affairs. And if you think about your own training, many of you here in the audience are scientists. I was trained as a scientist. I have a PhD in molecular biology. Most of my studies, for most of my time as a researcher, I never heard the word diplomacy. It was never presented to me that my science or the science of anyone around me could ever make an impact or be useful for a policy or diplomacy process. And similarly, on the other side, most, and maybe Ambassador Igor can also share with us his story, but most of us going into diplomacy roles, very few times they have a scientific or technological expertise. And what that means is when you come to a challenge that has technological, scientific, and diplomatic dimensions, such as climate change, such as COVID-19, you find that the interface is really, really hard to build on an emergency, right? You have to have those communities much more integrated since early on in order to jointly tackle those challenges that have both scientific and diplomatic relations. So realizing this, the former Commissioner for Research and Innovation in the EU, Carlos Moedas, in 2014, set out to build or to try to devise the first strategy or the first approach for science diplomacy for the EU. If you will remember, the mandate of Carlos Moedas had 3 pillars, focusing on open science, open innovation, and a third pillar, which is the one that concerns us today, was the open to the world. And what that meant was that science, international science collaboration and the European research area should respond and answer some of the bigger priorities of the Commission to address global challenges and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So Commissioner Moedas wrote a paper in Science and Diplomacy, which is the journal by AAAS that I was working at the time in Washington, D.C., setting the basis or outlining the vision for what science diplomacy would mean for the European Union. And what he meant, which was very, very interesting, and I think still it holds true today, but it's more and more subject to challenges, and I think my colleagues after will speak to this, is that the EU sees science diplomacy as a natural extension of European values. What are the European values? Multilateralism, gender equality, sustainability, global solidarity, and standing up for something bigger than yourself. And for this, kind of an aspirational approach over the last 5 years, we have seen many challenges: geopolitical challenges, competition challenges, great power competition, and the fragmentation of the multilateral system. And so when we have COVID-19 hitting us, a global pandemic that we were not prepared, not because scientists had not predicted it. Scientists knew that this was coming, but we didn't have the proper science diplomacy interfaces ready to act. When climate change gets to the point of no return, like we are today, we don't yet have the integration of science and diplomacy to properly respond to the scale and the magnitude of the challenge. And so Carlos was very visionary in setting this approach and trying to find what the potential instruments and mechanisms could look like. So how does science diplomacy translate to reality? So as Val has mentioned, I was privileged to be part of a high-level expert group advising the commissioner on how to think about this science diplomacy strategy. And one of the first and the most, I think, successful products of this was actually from our next speaker, Luke Van Langenhoven, how to make science diplomacy operational. So we commissioned this report to Luke, and he started to devise what the framework for science diplomacy in the EU could look like, and what are the different dimensions, pillars, and tools that we need to take into account. So in 2017, we received this framework of different types of tools, strategic tools, operational tools, and support tools to advance science diplomacy in the EU. And if you think about what we're doing today, this event, this awareness raising, training, networking, dialogue. These are all support tools that can promote, facilitate science diplomacy activities. But before that can happen, we need a high-level strategic tool. So those are the policy documents that give the directions of what do we want to achieve and how, and then the operational tools. So the policy instruments, the funding, the mechanisms, the types of profiles that we need capacity, that we need to build capacity for. For instance, we need to insert more scientists in our foreign ministries, in our EU delegations, in our embassies, for example. Those are different operational tools that we can insert to promote science diplomacy. And so what those operational tools look like? So very easy, I think, to imagine as we are here in this EU ASEAN workshop, that many of those tools are actually in place by promoting joint research and innovation between two regions. And so here you have a number of examples of science diplomacy initiatives, which are joint funding programs between the EU countries and other countries that allow to promote these relationships through science that perhaps are not so easy to achieve through other means. And so, for instance, we have, you probably heard, the Sesame Synchrotron, which is a synchrotron that's built in Jordan that brings together countries from the Middle East to together work on some challenges in a time and a climate that is not conducive perhaps to other forms of dialogue in other aspects of the relationship. And I think the most remarkable and successful outcome of this push for science diplomacy that was done in the previous decade was the funding, the inclusion of science diplomacy in the work program of Horizon 2020. So science diplomacy became a research topic. It was the first place in the world where science diplomacy was actually given that, that status of a very important research pillar in the EU. And 3 projects were born out of these calls, ELCID, INSIGHT, and S4D4C. You will hear from my colleagues who were part of ELCID. I was part of S4D4C. And together, after these projects ended, because as you know, one of the downsides of research projects is that they have an expiry date, right? But to put into practice all of the research, all of the tools, the training, the materials, and the academic base for science diplomacy that was generated through these 3 projects, we set up what we call the, oops, sorry, my screen went away. It was the last slide, so. Let me just go back to it. One second. I don't know what happened. Sorry. Okay, here we go again. Okay, so after these 3 projects ended, and one of them is still ongoing until next year, INSIGHT, we set up what we call the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance. And you can see in the screen all of the initial members, but it is also open to members outside of the EU. So any organizations that you belong to in ASEAN could be part of our European Science Diplomacy Alliance to keep all of those, all the members of this consortia that were formed thanks to these research projects to keep them engaged and further the impact of all the outputs that we had. And so in 2019, as the Commission was changing and we were transitioning to Ursula von der Leyen and the new Commission, we set out this kind of future recommendation, what's next for the next Commission and how we can continue and strengthen this science diplomacy journey that that began with former Commissioner. And so where we are now is in a much more geopolitical Commission that wants to boost the role of the EU in the world, but it wants to do it in a mutual playing field. It wants to do it according to European values. And I would love to discuss what are the challenges to achieve that with my fellow panelists. There has been a lot of progress in terms of boosting capacities, for instance, in the European External Action Service, the EU delegations that plan to beef up their scientific capacities a lot more. And for example, the first science and technology advisor to EAS was appointed just last year. So a very positive and welcome development. Speaking of climate change, the European Green Deal, probably the most ambitious target that we've ever had, by which we want to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. Of course, the new framework program, Horizon Europe, that has a much more mission-oriented research policy approach, and also the new strategy for international cooperation for Horizon Europe and in overall research and innovation that is called the Global Approach. It also focuses on science diplomacy, although we think that it should have a bigger emphasis, and my colleague Eric can talk more about this. And finally, just a very recent development and very also promising, just a few weeks ago, that the EU Competitiveness Council formally mandated the European Commission and the External Action Service to develop an EU science diplomacy agenda. So hopefully, after these 7 years of journey of trying to put science diplomacy on the agenda for the European Union, we will have a tangible strategy that we can then deploy and help bridge those gaps between the scientific and the diplomatic world that have taken us here, and we can see the results of having that disconnect and that gap. So hopefully this is a step in the right direction. And with that, I will finish here. I'm happy to answer questions and discuss with my fellow panelists. Hopefully this is an overview that allows you to frame the discussions that we're going to have in the next few days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marga, for that grounding of information regarding science diplomacy in the EU landscape. I think it's very important that Dr. Marga had mentioned, very importantly, of the tangible things that follow on after these frameworks, debates, and conversations get on when it comes to science diplomacy and technology cooperation to support policy. Thank you so much for that, Doc Marga, and we'll have questions for you on the way in a while. But before that, we have over 200 participants in our webinar for this morning. We want to know, apart from where you're coming from, we want to know what are your thoughts on science diplomacy. Can you comment them on our Zoom chat box from wherever you may be in the world? I saw a participant there from Tunisia. Let us know, what are your thoughts on science diplomacy? Do you understand the bulk of science diplomacy? What more about science diplomacy would you want to understand? While you are sending over your questions and insights regarding science diplomacy, allow me to introduce our next speaker for this morning. Our next speaker is actually presenting a speech that was co-created and co-designed by his fellow colleague in the institution that he works for. Allow me to introduce our next speaker for this morning. Dr. Eric Piaget is a research fellow of United Nations University. Dr. Eric Piaget is a visiting research fellow at the United Nations University's Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies, where he, along with Professor Van Langenhoeve, helped set up UNTRAD, or UNTRAD, the Unit on Non-Traditional Diplomacy. UNTRAD examines the shifts in the practice of diplomacy and focuses on new areas in which non-traditional diplomacy may help mitigate the challenges of the 21st century. Dr. Eric's main areas of interest are public diplomacy, science diplomacy, and the overlap between the two. Prior to academia, Eric enjoyed a decade-long career in international and EU affairs, working for the Swedish MFA, the EU, think tanks, and NGO. Dr. Eric will be joined by the academic director of the Institute for European Studies, Professor Dr. Luc van Langenhol. He's the academic director since 2017 of December, as well as the academic commissioner for institutional institutes and networks since September 2018 at the allow me to get this right if I get this right, Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Very difficult. Ladies and gentlemen, for their talk, here's Dr. Eric Piaget.
Thank you very much. That was a very lovely introduction. Yes, and unfortunately, Luc can't be here today. It's his birthday, so that's why I'm stepping in for him. But we've worked together at the United Nations University in Bruges, where, as you said, we established UNTRAD, that seeks to examine the rapidly changing parameters of international affairs, and science diplomacy plays a very starring role in that capacity. So in this presentation, or this speech, I will just give a brief overview of science diplomacy. Margaret did a very good job addressing that, but I'll also mention sort of the development it's gone through into its current stage, and then provide a critical assessment of the current state of science diplomacy, and argue that it needs to change in order to better address the plethora of borderless challenges, from climate change to famines to pandemics to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. All of these issues have both diplomatic and scientific implications. So we will address the possible avenue that science diplomacy can travel down in order to better tackle the realities of the day. So science diplomacy, it's the broad range of activities at the intersection of science and foreign affairs. And it creates a symbiotic nexus that's capable of addressing a variety of transnational problems and promoting understanding and increasing prosperity. And that's in the idealized form of it. And this intersection, it's not new, although the theoretical underpinnings have developed in the last 20 years. But in fact, the intersection of science and diplomacy travel back to antiquity. I'm a historian by training, so I find sort of historic examples very interesting, and maybe you will too. I won't spend too much time on it, but I think it adds a little bit of substance to it when you realize that even back in 1300 BC, there was a peace treaty between ancient Egypt and the Hittite kingdom, and it resulted in an exchange of scientific nature when the Hittite king wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh asking for medical expertise so to help his sister conceive. And in my own research, I came across this German inventor and diplomat, Otto von Guercke, who represented the German city of Magdeburg at the Peace of Westphalia, and was able to sort of augment his diplomatic clout by wooing his colleagues with the vacuum that he invented. And Ben Franklin is another very good example. As ambassador of France, that role was arguably very much aided by his scientific pursuits that embodied the spirit of the Enlightenment. But in the Cold War is when there's many, many different examples of science and foreign policy overlapping. I think probably the most emblematic is when the Apollo and the Soyuz, they docked in outer space, and the astronaut and the cosmonaut shook hands, which sort of coincided with the détente periods. And then there was a lot of other collaborations with regard to vaccines for polio and smallpox, and then the Antarctic Treaty. And then during the Cold War, scientists also took their own initiative with diplomatic and scientific implications, such as the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs in Nova Scotia, which was championed by Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein. But the thing about all of these examples I just listed, they were never considered science diplomacy as they were happening. It was only looking in hindsight that they received this label. In fact, science diplomacy is often used as an accounting tool. it was only after the Cold War that the theoretical underpinning started to develop. I think you could trace it back to Joseph Nye, who came up with the notion of soft power, the idea that states exert influence through culture, foreign policy, and political institutions or values, of which the science systems are part of the soft power apparatus. And this kicked off a more conscious effort of states to exert influence through science and the international system. Though it wasn't until the start of the millennium that science diplomacy became a widely used term in policy documents introduced both by governments and scientific academies like the Royal Society or the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And yes, this report, The New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy from 2010, which was a result of a conference held by Royal Society and the AAAS, is perhaps one of the most momentous occasions for the conceptualization of science diplomacy, because it outlined science diplomacy in the three tenets: science in diplomacy, which refers to the scientific expertise being woven into the diplomatic process; diplomacy for science, where diplomatic activity paves the way for wider scientific collaboration; and science for diplomacy, referring to the process of scientific collaboration serving as a conduit for greater diplomatic engagement. Now, I think this is a very, very helpful classification, and you can tell that many others think the same due to its spanning application. But it does have a few shortcomings. For example, there are many instances of science diplomacy that can fall into all of the different tenets, like the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, for example, designating the South Pole as a global commons for scientific purposes. On one hand, it could be an example of diplomacy for science due to diplomatic action that paved the way for the scientific collaboration. Or on the other hand, by virtue of having scientists from many different countries that didn't always agree politically, such as the USSR and the US, you could label it as science for diplomacy. Or due to all of the important research that is generated from Antarctica that feeds into climate negotiations, you could also call it science in diplomacy. So as a result, science diplomacy in this form, it ends up standing for many different things, and thus what it stands for is a little bit ambiguous. And it's many different activities are considered science diplomacy as well. Government incentives to attract foreign scientists to their lands, or international exchange programs that foster scientific cooperation, or when MFAs appoint scientific advisors or science attachés to their missions, or the science diplomacy umbrella is always overhead. And also when scientists interact in like the context of conflict resolution, that is also science diplomacy. And there's also a tendency for science diplomacy to abide by an overly romanticized view of science. One is this pristine forum of inquiry and discovery built on virtues of rationality, universality, neutrality, transparency. But in doing so, there's a very good quote by Bronowski: "Those who think science is ethically neutral confuse the findings of science, which are, with the activity of science, which is not." And in that context, there are many different examples, such as the Manhattan Project or Operation Paperclip, which were international scientific collaborations, but with slightly, well, significantly more damaging than helpful objectives. And this romanticization of science also blurs the dichotomy between science as a cooperative enterprise on one hand and as a competitive one on the other. It's trapped in this growing antagonism between openness and technological sovereignty. And there's also the question of ownership. Is it governments? Is it scientists? Both diplomats and scientists have very different mindsets. The one is focused on discovery, and the other is more focused on compromise, finding common ground versus finding new ground. So there is a bit of a plane that needs to be smoothed out first. And scientists, I think, need to acquire greater ownership of science diplomacy. and decouple the practice from national governments and positioning it as a global response to global problems. And indeed, the current age is defined by this long list of global challenges. But on the other hand, it's also defined by this exponential growth of knowledge about these problems. Digital revolution coupled with globalization has meant that this knowledge can travel anywhere instantaneously. And there's hardly any excuse not to tackle the significant problems we face. However, knowledge is overwhelmingly reserved in national spheres to bolster knowledge economies and national innovation systems. And as a result, the global commons of knowledge as such is left underutilized in its magnificent potential to tackle all of these problems. I mean, there have been very commendable steps in the EU, for example. There's the open science policy, which has the European Open Science Cloud that makes data available under the FAIR principles, findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. But nonetheless, science and scientific knowledge is still trapped in this dichotomy between openness and competition. And as it stands, we know the challenges of, say, climate change due to decades of research into it, but we hesitate to move forward and instead reserve often push the ball into the court of Bill Gates to tell us what to do. So this is why the original triple definition of science diplomacy, science in diplomacy, science for diplomacy, and diplomacy for science, urgently needs to be expanded and to bring forth a fourth dimension, which is the use of diplomatic skills and tools in advocating for global scientific knowledge, the translation of science into societal impact. In the original terminology, you could call it diplomacy in science, although it might be better to think of it as simply knowledge diplomacy in order to avoid the romanticized connotations. It boils down to strengthening the diplomatic capabilities of the producers and distributors of scientific knowledge. So first, in doing so, it can strengthen the scientific systems diplomatic capabilities, fortifying a channel for combating the growing anti-scientism sentiments that have unfortunately come about in recent years. And second, it can help repair fragmentation between these silos, because scientists tend to be very highly specialized in certain fields, but the interdisciplinary aspect of it is often missing. And third, it can empower potential factor scientific knowledge into important societal debates, actually bringing the science into the debates. Using the IPCC as a framework for this is a very good example of synthesizing complex scientific knowledge into actual policy advice. And also knowledge diplomacy, or diplomacy in science, stands to further professionalize the dialogue between researchers, scientists, and policymakers. So this all sounds promising, perhaps, but how do you actually apply it into practice? Getting scientific experts to adopt more diplomatic job descriptions through the leveraging of their scientific knowledge for wider objectives probably will not happen in any meaningful way unless there are sort of concrete support mechanisms. And this is why we think universities need to be more ingrained in the process. They can play a key role in including science diplomacy into their curricula, whilst also requiring researchers to realize that scientific work being conducted also has diplomatic dimension to it. But in order to get to this stage, there are some core activities that universities must engage in. Strengthening, through investment and career development prospects, the capabilities of synthesizing scientific knowledge. Second, constructing or fortifying the bridges between university scientific experts on one hand, and policymakers and civil society on the other. Third, developing monitoring mechanisms for the effectiveness and efficiency of university-driven science diplomacy practices, so that ones that are good can be shared and bad ones can be discarded. And fourth, actually constructing a culture of science diplomacy, because as it stands, most science diplomats, there's a degree of serendipity in the field, and that they stumble into it as opposed to aspiring to it from a young age. As Marga mentioned, we're part of the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance, and most of our members are either scientists that appreciated the diplomatic dimension of their scientific research, or people like me with international relations background, who appreciate the scientific dimension of foreign affairs. And universities can help sow the seeds for a richer culture for that. But first, universities, the interdependence between higher education institutions and national innovation systems has to be decoupled to some degree. And if universities and research institutions are to become the vanguards of the global commons of knowledge, there needs to be support mechanisms in order to put that into place. And this can be done by extending the system of rewards to reward knowledge production for global commons in such a way that it is currently done for national innovation systems. So to conclude, an open to the world scientific sensibility should still be guiding, because science is in fact global, but the openness should thus be geared towards common goals, and as a result, reciprocity should expected to occur. So thank you very much.
Dr. Eric, thank you so much for that insightful discussion. I think I took down some notes here and I learned a lot myself. Science diplomacy is a fairly new subject matter for me, so this was a very great learning experience. Dr. Eric had discussed the broad range of the nexus and intersection of science and policy in a very understandable and digestible manner. So thank you for that, Dr. Eric. I especially loved how you mentioned the differences between science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. It's really a broad range, yeah, and there are so many nuances to these terms that make it more challenging, but at the same time more specific for our differences in goals. And that's true that Dr. Eric mentioned, that science is a highly specialized field, and sometimes we get lost in communicating the importance of science and scientific discovery and advances, and we need to be able to push that and put it into our work in science diplomacy, because in diplomacy, we, apart from conversing or having agreements with governments and institutions, it's also important that we speak to the masses. We speak to civil society, NGO, academia, and media. So thank you so much for that very insightful discussion. In fact, our participants here over at the Zoom have incredible insights as well, lifting off from Dr. Eric's talk and Dr. Marga's talk. I'll hand them back here on the front stage, Dr. Eric and Dr. Marga, to have a quick conversation and some questions and discussion about science diplomacy. Before I ask those questions, I'd just love to read over some insights from our participants here in the Zoom chat box. Nor Fariza Modnor said, effective partnerships between scientists and policymakers around the world will provide opportunities to address various challenges and problems we are experiencing. You know, in the COP26 is happening now. World leaders are making decisions, policymakers are making decisions, and they are all informed by the science. And we need leaders, we need global leaders who not only believe in the science, but also listen to the science and respond to the science. And I think COP26 is a great test and exercise to see that happening. Arsenio Lourdes says, it is amazing that this science diplomacy can push governments to involve scientists into the different areas of government service. It encourages more research-based policy, programs, and projects. Unfortunately, this will be a big problem if the country head and legislators do not see its importance and relevance. We have one final comment from Dimfna Javier from the Philippines. I think science diplomacy aims to forge collaborations between scientists, science practitioners, community members, and policymakers for the purpose of improving the quality of life of those especially who most need it. Yeah, I think this is a mention of how science and diplomacy, we don't work in silos. We need to work in a whole of nation approach, whole of society approach. We have a question here for Dr. Eric and Dr. Marga. Feel free to just jump in for insights on this question. It says here, how can countries promote, number one, and operationalize, number two, science diplomacy to address climate change and the global pandemic? Can we cite current examples if there are working models that we can take inspiration from? I'll let Dr. Marga answer this first, and then we'll proceed to Dr. Eric.
Thank you very much, Val, and thanks, Eric. This was a very good, wide-ranging presentations. I made a list of all of the issues that we have to debate. I don't know if we will have time. And I have a question for you, but before that, I'll answer the question from our audience.
Yeah.
So yes, there are more and more countries that are now setting up their national science diplomacy strategies. This is a fairly new development, but for instance, Spain, thanks to this involvement with the EU, actually, kind of a symbiosis between a kind of a multilateral supranational push for it, that prompts countries to look inwards and see whether they have the appropriate mechanisms domestically for science diplomacy. So for example, Spain, as a result of all of this debate and discourse for science diplomacy in the EU, launched its science diplomacy strategy in 2016. And then with S4D4C and the other members of this Horizon 2020 projects, the Madrid Declaration on Science Diplomacy in 2018, which became really a model, I think, for many other countries to get inspired to set up their own strategies. A lot of those strategies are also happening right now in Latin America. There's a lot of momentum there. But I will say that, so two things. For a country to have operational science diplomacy doesn't mean that they need to have a strategy that's published on the website and they say this is from now on our strategy on science diplomacy. Many countries with a long tradition of integration between science and foreign affairs, such as the US, such as the UK, they have had this long tradition of instruments and mechanisms, and they never called it a science diplomacy strategy. So it is something that has been built, for instance, or baked into the foreign policy of many countries already. Many countries have science attachés and science counselors in their embassies. They have kind of science diplomacy hubs around the world, like Switzerland has a network called SwissNext. And of course, the EU has the science counselors as well in EU delegations. So those structures predate the actual emergence of or how when science diplomacy became trendy, to put it in a way. However, it is useful to have those frameworks, because if you cannot, and as Eric was saying, if you don't have words or terms to label something, it's very difficult to put it into practice, to operationalize it, to measure it, to teach it, to research it, to make policies for it. It is really hard if science diplomacy remains this abstract idea. So it's important that we put some of those mechanisms in place. And I think countries that do not have a strong connection between their science and foreign ministry, for example, it's really hard that they can project a science diplomacy strategy outwards if they don't have those communications internally. So think about your countries, the ASEAN countries of the participants that you are in today here. In how many of your countries the science and the foreign ministry have a regular dialogue? Or even, do you even have a science ministry? I mean, many countries don't even have that, right? And so it is still a long way to go in terms of the institutional capacity building. So we have been focusing perhaps too much on individual capacity building. So with the European Science Diplomacy Alliance and the 3 Horizon 2020, we did a lot of training, a lot of workshops, but those really are individual targeted. They are not so much institutional targeted. And we need, I think, an institutional transformation. The foreign ministries need to adapt their structure to welcome and embed this scientific and technological capacity by appointing these types of profiles that we've already discussed. But I would say it's still quite we were still far away. And if you look at the COVID response, in the beginning, all the chaos with the procurement of masks and PPE and all of that, the foreign ministries, it's an anecdote that I always like to say, in many countries, they got fake and fraud, they got tricked into many scientific products that the foreign ministry, in buying and purchasing large amounts of products that were not up to standards because they didn't have scientific experts in-house that could tell them, this is what you need to buy. This is an actual good PCR test reagent. This is an actual good instrument. And this was really obvious in the beginning of the pandemic. And it kind of shows the contrast between how scientists work together so fast to identify this virus, to sequence it, to design the vaccine in 48 hours, in February or in January, right? Just a few weeks after the virus was identified. And that contrasts so much with the political will, where the fragmentation of the response, the closing of borders, the building of walls, and the turning inward completely. And I think that was an amazing case study, sadly, because it's not every day that you can put all your theories to practice. And I think science diplomacy, we had a lot of assumptions that really didn't hold when we were faced with a real world case study. And I think this speaks to what Eric has mentioned as well in terms of de-romanticizing science diplomacy and being careful not to transfer the idealistic views of the scientific community, which are very good. And we need those aspirational universalist views. Scientists want to work for the common good. Scientists don't see borders. Scientists collaborate no matter what the political sign of the other scientist, the nationality, culture, religion. Those are fantastic bridges, but we cannot ignore those very strong other factors that will determine whether science can succeed in saving us from global catastrophe. I think we need a bit of a reality check in this sense.
Thank you, Dr. Marga. Interesting that you brought up political will in terms of science diplomacy. I have a question in mind regarding that, but let's jump on over to Dr. Eric first for his insights regarding that question on how countries can promote and operationalize science diplomacy. And if you have any experience on models to follow on, you can mention it, Dr. Eric.
Well, I very much I agree with everything that Marga said, but in order to operationalize, I mean, you can make strategies day and night, but as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you really need to have a culture as well that sort of feeds into it, and then I think strategy will be a much easier thing to develop. But also, I think it's helpful to also look at it beyond the national sphere, because that was one thing that I've mentioned about how science diplomacy sort of develops within the theoretical house of soft power, and how countries can exert influence on the world stage. But I don't think that influence is really the most like, I wouldn't say that using science diplomacy to influence is very, very productive. And I think engaging much more on a multilateral level actually achieves objectives that science diplomacy aims to reach, because many of the problems that we are facing, they are completely international. They don't abide by borders whatsoever. So national strategies to enhance national interest, it's counterproductive towards the notion that we have to have multilateral international steps taken towards reaching this. So I don't know if that added any more clarity to it, but that I think just culture is generally the key to materializing strategy. I think
Thank you, Dr. Eric. We have here responses on the issue on political will and science diplomacy. We have here responses also from the Zoom chat box. Sorry, Dr. Marga, did you want to add anything? Oh, okay. I saw you unmute. Thank you. We have here responses. Rogelio Diaz from the Philippines says, Convincing Filipino legislators is a big challenge due to lack of appreciation of the scientific disciplines or due to conflicting interests that they represent. So it's timely that in the 2022 national elections, we will choose leaders who believe in science and who can present a more comprehensive climate action program in their climate agenda. Alfonso Madrono shares the same sentiment. Choosing science-friendly legislators is a great step. However, the difficulty lies in enforcing the laws. There are many laws in place, but big businesses are overstepping current laws that protect the environment. Dr. Marga, Dr. Eric, and maybe I'll proceed to you first, Dr. Eric. What do you think? What reason do you think is disallowing policymakers from responding to the science and listening to the science? What is holding them back? This political will on science diplomacy. What could be holding them back, and how can we best respond to it? I'm sure your experience working with governments, you would have insights for this. Anyone can take the...
I believe in science, so I find it a little confusing when people don't. But I suppose science is quite complex. Like the steps of scientific inquiry require lots of training, and those that are scientists have the credentials to actually find new knowledge, and perhaps I think it stems from this sort of distrust for elites, and those with scientific education are, I suppose, in eyes of many, considered to be part of the elite. And there's also this proliferation of disinformation that sort of challenges sort of scientific research, and as a result, it just creates this massive storm of confusion, and it's very hard to navigate. And then, of course, luckily, the populist movements that we've experienced have decreased in their vicious potency to some degree. But I mean, that really capitalized on this sort of distrust and confusion and this ecosystem of not really knowing what's right and what's wrong. And I think, science is pretty synonymous with truth in my opinion, and I think in an objective in terms of an objective analysis of it. But that, I think, has sort of fallen in the unfortunately, due to lots of these currents of distrust, and that it has become a victim. But hopefully that is getting better. Marga, I would be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. So there are many layers to this question. It's extremely pertinent. I think, first of all, if we think of democracies and many legislators that are elected for 2-year terms, many presidents are elected for 4-year terms, 6-year terms, it is really challenging to look forward to the long term and not stay with crisis and the present day, right? And so the incentives of a legislator who is elected for 2 years, the moment she steps into the role, she has to start fundraising and raising the votes for the next election. And it's really very grassroots, like in connection to the people, going around the districts, having those one-on-one conversations about the day-to-day problems of people. So if we cannot connect science and climate change and everything we aspire to achieve with science diplomacy globally to the local day-to-day experiences of people's lives, then this is how I think we foster this idea of science being elitist, being something that's far away from people and just being for a few elite. And so I was hoping that COVID would bring that home, right? That every single person on this planet has felt the impact of COVID in a different way, of course, some much more intensely than others, but it's the first global simultaneous crisis that we all feel. And I was hoping that this would really kind of awaken our realization that science is critical, that we need to invest in science, that we need to elect politicians and leaders that will follow the science. but it's not clear that this has been achieved, right? And also I was hoping that the COVID would kind of push the renewal and strengthening of the multilateral system. It is also not clear that we are achieving that, and we'll see at COP26 how does this play out, right? So it is really, I think, one of the key challenges, the agenda, the timelines, the long term versus the short term, and how do we make people realize, not make people realize, because it's a fact that without science we will not solve this crisis or any other. But we need to do a better job in terms of electing better leaders that are scientifically minded. There's a few programs in the US, I don't know if in other parts of the world they exist, that now are preparing scientists to run for office. So it is part of this diversification of scientific careers, that the idea that scientists not just have to be in the lab and publish papers and be academic. Scientists can fulfill roles in every part of society, including politics and policy. So now there are some efforts to bring more scientists as elected officials, and so they can have this mindset already. And so those are the different mechanisms, and we can talk about it another day in terms of mechanisms of science advice, having offices in parliament that provide scientific input to the bills that are being debated, so there's an evidence base for what's being discussed. And most countries still don't have those mechanisms, in-house mechanisms in their parliament, but also in the executive branch. They do not have yet those structures in place. So a lot of work to do, but I think we at least have identified some of those pain points that will allow us to then work towards improving it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marga and Dr. Eric. It's very important that you emphasize that there is a lot of work to do, but it's challenging work, but it's not impossible work. We have the resources, we have knowledge leaders and experts such as yourself, Dr. Eric and Dr. Marga, to be able to assist governments to work for science diplomacy. This has been a really important and helpful conversation, especially as personally, as I go into COP26 day 2 today there in Glasgow. It's going to help me with this. It's going to give me new knowledge in science diplomacy, because I do a lot of advocacy work on the ground with communities in the Philippines. And now we're up at a stage where we talk diplomacy, we talk science, we talk climate. And I think this is a very worthwhile discussion that I'm hearing from our experts, Dr. Eric and Dr. Marga, to help inform my presence at COP26, and also in the series that we are producing with Living Laudato Si and Action Klima called Klima Minute, where we talk about COP26 for young people. This conversation in science diplomacy and climate change diplomacy is very high level. So we want to reach the level of young people who can understand the topic better. This has been, again, a very fruitful, helpful, productive discussion. And I thank you, Dr. Eric Piaget and Dr. Marga Gual-Soler, for this discussion. I think this has stirred some debates and insights from our Zoom chat box and even among our speakers. And that's why in the roundtable discussion coming up next, we will have science diplomats themselves to talk about some of the issues that have been brought up in our discussion, Dr. Eric and Dr. Marga. I would like to introduce our moderator for this next session. They will have a discussion on accelerating action towards climate goals, science diplomacy as key. The moderator, and I'm turning this over to our moderator, is the founder and chairman of Climate Smart and Disaster Resilient ASEAN, also the chairperson of the US ASEAN Fellows for Science and Technology, Asian Science Diplomats, also a climate diplomat of the EU-Asia Expert Panel for Climate Diplomacy, a fellow of the Philippine Council for Foreign Relations, and the president of the Environmental and Climate Change Research Institute. I'm going to turn over the panel discussion to now our moderator, Glenn Suerte Felipe Banaguas. It was such a great honor and pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, Doc Jenny and Dr. Susan and Uraxes. Be blessed, everybody.